Hello, hello, hello. All right. Today is the Civil War Part 2. We're very close. We only have two more lectures after this one. All right. Today, what we're going to cover are the advantages and disadvantages of the North and South, the war itself, and we'll talk about Lincoln and Emancipation Proclamation, your other two key points for. Here, let me make sure. But let's see. Yeah, Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation are two last key points for the Civil War. All right, so today, like I said, part two of the Civil War, and we're going to start with advantages and disadvantages in the North and in the South. All right, so we'll start with the North and move on from there. As far as Northern advantages go, one of the things you'll see is a huge one is population. All right. You got 23 million Northerners as opposed to 9 million Southerners. And that right there is just huge. But you got to take into account that 4.5 million of them were African American slaves that the South would never arm. So that drops to about 5 million Southerners available to fight. And with this, if you remember what we talked about in the Civil War Part 1, this idea of Nickajack, the Free State of Winston, Jones County, Mississippi, the Free State of Jones, all of these Southerners that were refusing to secede from the Union, or when secession happened, they seceded from the Confederacy and the Union and formed their own place. So you don't even have really 5 million Southerners that will fight. You have it a lot smaller than that. So this is a huge advantage for the Northeast. This gives them superior numbers in the military and also plenty of people to keep the factories and economic system going. Also, materially, they have the advantage because with this, you see industry. They can create whatever they need for warfare. Also, transportation is huge. The trains are a major part of what makes this war, what for the North makes the war extremely efficient because they can ship troops or goods anywhere they want quickly and reliably. Transportation, like I said, is big along with that materialism, but also a big, huge thing is capital, money. Um, the large majority of banks resided in the North, and the big banking houses were in the North. And with this, the North has a 10-to-1 capital advantage. All right. Also, the North has a very strong centralized government, right? Government doesn't change for the Northerners. They keep going with the same government we've had since the beginning of the Constitution. And also, the North has an inspirational leader. All right, Abraham Lincoln, huge figure. What I really want you guys to do with him is kind of dig in, research, look around, kind of give a basic overview of Lincoln before, during the Civil War. Just kind of look at his political career. So that can be something to do this week to take notes on. Dig into Lincoln, look at his political career in the 50s through the 60s. All right. He is highly inspirational. One of the things you'll see throughout America, he is either just adored and loved or hated and despised. All right. People either want to join and help him do what he wants to do or kill him. I mean, either way you look at it, that is an inspirational leader. This man inspires people to do good and bad. All right. So we have the northern advantages. All right. We also have the northern disadvantages. All right. First and foremost, geography, our location, however you want to look at it. Most of this war is fought in the south, which means the north comes here to do it, goes into the south to fight. So this is unfamiliar territory to them. They're fighting on land and in areas they know very, very little about. Also, you have the opinion of the war. Large groups, large swaths of people in the Northeast and North in general don't want any part of this war. So this is a big thing. You've got Lincoln the entire war trying to convince people that this is a must, that this needs to happen. And he doesn't convince everybody. Though the Southerners have gone, right? So the Democratic Party is weakened severely because the Southern planters, in many ways, had a big role in the Democratic Party. And when the Southerners left, this was another thing that helped, was an advantage for the Union, because they were able to operate without the South fighting against them in Congress, right? But not everybody in the North, like I said, liked this war or wanted this war. Many of the Democrats of the North were fine with the South seceding. They didn't want to go to war over this. They just wanted to let them go. And a individual that played a big role in pushing this idea and gave Lincoln huge fits and problems was Clement Van Landingham. All right. Van Landingham was the leader of a group of Democrats, usually referred to as the Copperheads. They did not want to go to war, and during the war itself, they pushed to end this war, to sign peace with the South and let them create their own world. So you had opinion in the North. These Democrats and quite a few Republicans viewed Lincoln as a tyrant. So that would be a big disadvantage in the North for Lincoln. And also, for the disadvantages that the North would have, they would have all the Southern advantages, which we'll get into now. As far as advantages go, all of these advantages, except one, is a double-edged sword. What I mean by that is, both sides of the sword cuts. So, on one hand, when it's used one way, it's an advantage, but it could be used another way, that it's just as much a disadvantage, right? So the first advantage, which is a double-edged sword, is the location, right? Geography. It is here. It is in the South. This war is fought on home soil for the Southerners. This allows one advantage in that Southern agriculturalists know the land very well, very intimately. Hunting and farming in the South, they knew the outdoors. So this was a big advantage in that they knew the layout of everything and how to use the lay of the land to fight against the larger Northern Army. All right. However, this is also a disadvantage, right? The disadvantage of this is it's being fought at home, and it's an agricultural place. So as the war goes on, as the battle spread, as it moves through the South, the Union is destroying fields, destroying food, destroying cotton, destroying the agriculture of the South. So you can see how it's an advantage and a disadvantage. By destroying the economics of the South, this helps quickly in this war instead of it dragging out for a decade or more. Also, this is an advantage because the Southerners know the lay of the land so well when they go up against the Northerners. One of the stories here in Alabama, in southern Alabama, is that this Confederate army saw this Northern army coming in, and what they did is set up a trick. What they would do is go into the hilly mountains of the area, and just march their small numbers over and over again around this mountain, making it look like they have superior numbers. So these Confederate military leaders would use the lay of the land, use tricks to convince the Northerners that they had superior numbers, and use the land to help them win in these battles. In that instance, when they kept going over and over the mountain, making it look like they have far superior numbers, the Northern Army surrendered to them. And when they did, they saw that these Confederates had very, very few troops. But, so you can get advantages, disadvantages in geography. Another is what most people have always said the South had. The reason many people push that the South was able to last in this battle, in this war, as long as they did, was because of the zeal and the unity of Southerners. Meaning that, they're Southern, they'll fight to the death for their home, which we've already talked about is not true. The Confederates, the people that joined the Confederacy, were like that, right? The pro-slave people and the planter elite, they were willing to fight and die for their cause. But you have large portions of the Southern population, like what we wanted to do here with the Free State of Nickajack, Winston County, Free State of Jones, and all throughout the rest of the South, you have these large swaths of Unionists, right? So on one side, you have that zeal and unity, but on the other side of the sword, you have those that don't want any part of this war, are siding with the Union, right? Another one that is a double-edged sword is European support, all right? What I mean by this is that both France and England really sided with the Confederacy. They didn't send troops, they didn't send military arms, they weren't openly supporting the Confederacy, but they liked the idea of the Confederacy splitting up America and making it weak. But at the same time, the South supplies them with what they want more than anything in the world, cotton. So they're going to side with them. So during this European support, the big issue is how far will they go, right? So they do, the British actually build a navy for the Confederacy, which works very well. They build small wooden ships, for the most part, pirate-like ships that become very efficient at fighting the Union Navy. But that's about the extent of that support. And we'll talk more about that later on when we talk about the war itself. The final Southern advantage, and the only advantage that wasn't double-edged, was military leadership. All right, people like Robert E. Lee, the Johnston brothers, Jeb Stuart, Stonewall Jackson, all of these, P.T. Beauregard, all of these Southern generals tended to be leaders of the American military before their states seceded and they went with those states. Lee was asked by Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis was the leader of the Confederacy, the president of the Confederacy, kind of. All right. So Lee was wanted to be the main general for both of the armies. And Lee really thought about it, took his time in answering, but in the end he decided to go with the Confederacy because he said he couldn't see himself fighting and killing his next door neighbors. But the Southern generals, the Southern military leadership, for the most part, was far superior across the board to the North. Of course, the North would have the two key generals to end all these things, Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. But numbers-wise, the South had more generals, more experience, more experienced and strategic generals than the North did. Also, of course, we have the disadvantages in the South, and the big one, of course, is population. Like we talked about, 9 billion people in the South, 4.5 million of them were slaves that would not be armed. The other 5 million were very divided over the issue of slavery and who they would fight for. So, population is a definite, huge disadvantage for the South. Also, they didn't really have any inspirational leaders outside of Robert E. Lee and a few of the major generals like the Johnston brothers. Jefferson Davis was considered the president of the Confederacy, but the Confederacy was a loose thing. Each state pretty much ran their own government. Each state ran their own military. And the Confederacy itself never took hold. No state surrendered to it. Davis would constantly be going around asking for money, begging for money to help fight this war. And each state said, no, we've got our own problems. We have our own military. We're going to do that. You do your own thing. So Davis was not inspirational whatsoever in the South. This also leads to, of course, another disadvantage, a weak government. When you have no unity and you have so many separate entities that believe themselves to be separate and should be separate, they don't work well together. And they fought a united union from the North. And of course, we've got all of the Northern advantages that we went over, like capital, numbers, transportation, material goods, all of those things that go against the South. So, quickly, we have kind of gone over and talked about the advantages and disadvantages. So we've kind of got the tail of the tape, like you see in a boxing match, comparing the physical attributes of the two fighters. And be honest, if you looked at this as advantages and disadvantages and based your bet in Vegas, who would you pick to win this war? The North or the South? The Union or the Confederacy? All right? Percentage-wise, you definitely have to go North, right? Because their advantages way outweigh everything else. So, with that, let's kind of get into and talk a little bit about leadership. All right. Like I said, in the South, some of the major people you can get into and read about. My favorite way, and has always been my favorite way to kind of study the Civil War, is through biographies. Historical biographies about individuals. And some of the more interesting ones to read about, I'll tell you the people to do, and where you can, if you want to read about the Civil War, you can get a first-hand account of it from these people. Jefferson Davis, there's some good biographies on him. Also in the South, you have Robert E. Lee, tons and tons of biographies on Lee. One of the classics is called The Marble Man, if you ever want to get into it. Also some really good ones on Stonewall Jackson. In many people's eyes, many Civil War historians' eyes, Stonewall Jackson was basically the heart and soul. Lee was the mind, Jackson was the heart and soul of the Army of Virginia, the army that took care of the Eastern Theater in the war. You also, of course, had Jeb Stuart, P.T. Beauregard, the Johnston brothers. They're fascinating to look at, and they mainly are in the Western Theater, and two extremely good generals as well. So you got some of the Southern people you can get biographies on and read it and get a Confederate, learn about the Confederate generals and leaders. And in the North, some really important people to go into. Of course, one is Abraham Lincoln. All kinds of biographies on Lincoln, right? And also, There's that movie with Daniel Day-Lewis playing Lincoln, just called Lincoln. It's out. You can watch it for one of your extra credit reports. Very, very good movie. Well done movie. But, Lincoln has a lot of biographies. The classic is a 2 volume by Sandburg, Carl Sandburg. Others to get into, of course, Ulysses S. Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, the 2 key generals that led the Union to victory and brought and united America back together because of these 2 major players. We also have Ambrose Burnside, George McClellan. All right. Those 2 generals were very important to Lincoln at the beginning of the war and never really got along with Lincoln, and Lincoln didn't get along with them. But they have very interesting views of the Civil War, and stories involved, their stories involved in the Civil War are interesting. So you can look into Burnside and McClellan. One of my favorites is just kind of crazy. Most people have never heard of him. Most people don't really even think about him. Even a lot of Civil War historians just mention him in passing most of the time. And that guy's name is Joseph Hooker. All right. Joseph Hooker was a cavalry leader. His men, when they were in the southern campaigns going through, whether they were taking place like New Orleans, Charleston, or whatever, his cavalry would be some of the first into the cities and to really help break things up, mix things up, cause chaos so the army could attack. And they would also be the ones that would be the last to leave the cities to kind of organize it and put it under military rule. So Hooker, wherever he went, whether it was when they took Charleston or when they took New Orleans or any southern commerce center, Hooker would kind of set up military rule in these places. And one of the things he did, culturally and socially speaking, would change things in America. I know I mentioned quite a few lectures ago how prostitution was a huge thing in America during the late 1800s, and that it was controlled by madams. It was controlled by women. Women ran it. Women participated in it. It was a female-controlled job, top to bottom. Big money for them. But this starts changing in the late 1800s, and one of the reasons it does is because of Hooker. Hooker, when he had come into these places like New Orleans or Charleston, he would take over the red light district. All right, a red light district is where the sex trade is, right? So Hooker would come in, take over these prostitutes, these whores, and use them. They would, he would pimp them out, right? He would put them out. They would be around the Union Army. They'd be around the Confederate Army. They'd be around people high and low, and they became his spy network. So places like Charleston, New Orleans, any of the large cities that the Union would capture, Joseph Hooker would take over prostitution and use them as a spy ring. And hence, why in the modern day, prostitutes, whores, however you want to look at it, are also called hookers. It comes from Joseph Hooker during the Civil War. And he's also the one that starts changing it, and he controls it instead of the madams. So this is where we get this shift, the beginning of where we get the shift from madams to pimps, right? With this is a long war. Post-Civil War, with the 70s, 80s, and 90s, this becomes a big thing. Madams and these men that are trying to come in and take over the control of prostitution have huge, huge scale warfare between one another. So, like I said, interesting reads. And Hooker is an interesting read. If you like war, sex, spying, well, there you go. Read about Joseph Hooker. So, with this, you guys have some of the leadership. We've talked about the advantages and disadvantages. So, continuing on, we're going to kind of put the war, like I say, in a nutshell. All right, a quick version. I'll kind of give you an overview of some of the major battles and some of the major things that occurred during this Civil War. All right. First and foremost, let's talk about war at sea in the Gulf and in the Atlantic. The North controlled this, mainly because they had a well-established navy and superior numbers. And with this, at the very beginning, at the very outset, they were able to blockade the South to hinder trade going in and out of the Confederacy. However, like I did say, the British did help build and create a decent navy, kind of a pirate navy. And one of the most successful of these British ships that the Confederacy would use would be the CSS Alabama. All right. It would sink numerous ships in this war and be one of the most successful parts of the Confederate Navy. Also, during this time, we have an experiment gone awry in the long run. It's called the CSS Hunley. This was a venture into kind of trying to create a weaponized submarine. All right. So this is a submarine that you could go in, fasten the lid, go underwater. You could probably get, somewhere between an hour or two of air. So you could stay down that long, but you would have to come up so you could open up and get more air and let the other out. It'd become harder and harder to breathe. So this was an airtight, watertight sub that was underwater, and it was going to be used to plant bombs on Union ships, try to break the blockade. So what they'd have is these bombs on an arm, right, out in front of the sub, where they would hit the ship. The bomb would stick into the hull of the ship. They would back up, take off, and it would detonate, hopefully destroying the ship. They would only use this, the Hunley, once. The day of, the arm broke, and they would do what they could to fix it. When they would get out there, they would go underwater, get out there, they would attach the bomb. It would be attached to the hull of a ship, but they couldn't break away. It took forever for them to break away from the bomb, and as they were trying to get out of there, as they were cranking and going with the sub, trying to get out of the bomb radius, it would explode, busting the seams of the Hunley and sinking the Hunley and killing its crew. So, many say this is one of the very first instances of submarine warfare in naval history. It worked and it failed, right? So, you've got the war at sea. Also, it's during this time you have the Merrimack from the Confederacy and the USS Monitor from the Union. These are what military historians refer to as Ironsides. These are plated ships, so cannonballs and fire could bounce off. More durable ships for battle. The Monitor and the Merrimack have some very famous battles if you want to get into them. Also, another thing to get into is that what we were talking about earlier, the European influence. All right. The British helped with funding, so did the French with money, and of course the British built a small navy for the Confederacy. But neither England or France would come out and recognize the Confederacy as a country, as an entity, and side with them. They would not become allies. The main reason England and France would not would be because of one man, France would kind of follow England's lead. The one man that would keep Europeans from joining in and creating alliances with the Confederacy is Charles Francis Adams. All right, here yet again, we're going to be talking about the Adams family. Remember, John Adams, very important during the Revolution. He and Jefferson are two keys of political philosophy in early American history. And then, of course, John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, would also become president, right? John Adams would be our second president. Then John Quincy Adams would be the president right before Andrew Jackson. And Charles Francis Adams was John Quincy Adams's, one of his kids, all right? And Charles Francis, he only really got involved in politics because it was the family trade and he was called upon. He never went into real places of power. He kind of stayed out of it as much as he could, but he tended to be an ambassador. He tended to be sent places to represent the USA around the world. And of course, one of the most important things he did, and one of the huge reasons that the Adams family is so important all the way through the 1800s, is he's the one that keeps the British from siding, right? He keeps talking, keeps there. He's always there with the British court, always there at Parliament, always talking about why England should stay neutral. And he convinces them to do this long enough that the tide of the war changes drastically in 63. So 61, 62, Charles Francis Adams is doing his best to keep the British as neutral as possible. And by 63, the Confederacy starts losing major battles, and the British and French just back away. All right, so Charles Francis Adams is of huge importance. I mean, imagine if the British and the French decided to ally themselves with the Confederacy. The Union would have a hard time surviving that. If the Confederacy had the English and the French on their side fighting, the war more than likely would come out very different. So Charles Francis Adams plays a big role in helping the Union win this war. All right. All right. So, for a little bit, I'm going to give you guys the layout. All right. The way the war went, you'll see in most American history classes and most American wars, you see one or two theaters. And it's just divided. If you study a war, it's usually divided by theaters. Like World War II, people talk about the European front and the South Pacific. So you'd have these two theaters of war. But the Civil War is the most studied war in American history. In fact, there are more Civil War history books than there are any other kind of history books. All right. It is the most studied, most written about event in American history. All right. So, it is divided into little sections. All right. All right. In 1861, you have the part of the war called the opening clashes. This is where South Carolinian militias would attack Fort Sumter. All right, that would happen on April the 12th through 13th of 1861. All right, this would be, of course, a Confederate victory, and they would take Fort Sumter. You also have the First Battle of Bull Run. It's also known as the First Battle of Manassas. This is in July of 61, and it is yet another Confederate victory. 1861, you had a lot of Confederate victories. Also, you have the next phase of the war, which is usually referred to as the Western Theater, and it takes place in 1862. All right. The Western Theater, of course, is something like, well, picture this: Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, the West, right? The West at that point, where the Eastern Theater is where where Lee is with his Army of Virginia. In the Western Theater, you have one major battle in 62, one big, huge battle in 62, and that's Shiloh. This is one of the bloodiest wars in American history. All right. And it would be a Union victory. Also, with this, you have Fort Henry and Fort Donelson that in February of 62 would fall to the Union, and these would be two major outposts that would, along with Shiloh, make a big, big problem for the Confederacy out west. So in the Western Theater, you'll see that the Union generals tend to win, and many times win big. Back east, the Army of Virginia tends to have the advantage for the first couple of years. All right, you also have the Virginia Theater. This is also in 62. We get the Second Battle of Bull Run, or the Second Battle of Manassas. You get the Battle of the 7 Days. Both of those are huge, large-scale battles, all right? And they're both Confederate victories. So in 61 and 62, so far, the Confederacy, all the way up through August of 62, the Confederacy is doing very well comparatively. However, a lot of that changes with the bloodiest single day in American history. And that, of course, is the Battle of Antietam. That occurs on September the 17th, 1862. Antietam is a Union victory, and more than 26,000 Americans die during the daylight hours of September the 17th, 1862. Think about that. 26,000 dead in one day of fighting. Antietam, by many historians, is viewed as a turning point, or the beginnings of a turning point. Lee was trying to commit all of his forces and really hit the Union Army, because if he did this at Antietam, he would have a quick march into D.C. and could take D.C. However, the Union found out about this plan, so they were ready for Lee and gave him a huge defeat. All right. The South would make one more stand in Fredericksburg, where they would win that in December of 62, but that was the last major victory for the Confederacy. With that, of course, that leads us to the year of 1863. Most historians refer to that year as the year of decision. You do have like Chickamauga and Chancellorsville where Confederates win victories, but the Union wins the larger ones. Like they win Vicksburg, which basically takes the Western Theater out. So the Western Theater, with the Battle of Vicksburg, has been dominated and now won by the Union in the West. The other big thing that's important is Gettysburg. Gettysburg, from July 1st through the 3rd, 1863, is a huge, huge Union victory that just seals the deal. Also, during this year, Lincoln knew that this was a year that had to go their way. This was a year that if the Union didn't start turning the tables, he was going to lose a lot of support in the North, and he was afraid of what the Europeans would do. So Gettysburg was huge for him. So was Antietam. With the victory at Antietam, he was able to release the Emancipation Proclamation, which is your last key point of the day. The Emancipation Proclamation, of course, comes out in January of 1863. And what it does is it states that the slaves in the rebelling states of the Union, in other words, the rebelling Confederate states of the Union, the slaves there are now free. He didn't free them in Maryland, Kentucky, or states that were Union occupied at the time, but all rebel states that had joined the Confederacy. Their slaves were now free. So technically, this did not free anybody. But this is Lincoln taking a stand on the issue of slavery for the first time. Another thing this has done, and is hugely important in the outcome of the Civil War, is one of the biggest things that the Emancipation Proclamation allowed is for African Americans to join the Union Navy and the Union Army. And with this, with them being allowed to join in this war effort and join the American Army and Navy, that gave Lincoln 350,000 new soldiers. That's a big boost after 3 bloody years of fighting. And these people were fighting for something deep, something they had to have, freedom, right? So the Emancipation Proclamation is important, but most people just, have always been taught that it freed the slaves when it actually didn't. Because none of the southern states recognized Lincoln as their president, and none of the southern states freed their slaves, not the ones that were in rebellion. So, but this does allow African Americans to be incorporated into the military. So, with all of this, we finally come to 1864, 1865. Many historians refer to this as the last stand. This is where you have William Tecumseh Sherman's march to the sea, where it starts in the Western Theater and goes all the way to the Atlantic coast, creating devastation and chaos everywhere he went. His army would level everywhere, destroy any resistance, freeing African American slaves as they went, and allowing the African Americans to come along with them, and burning and laying waste to everything around them. This was meant to be destructive warfare, inflicting so much damage, so much harm that the South could not continue. With this, during this march to the sea, Atlanta falls. You also have Petersburg. This would be Lee's last offensive. He would lose this. And at that point, it's almost over. Just the next month, when the South loses Richmond, that's it. They've lost Atlanta, New Orleans, Charleston. They lose Richmond, and the Confederacy crumbles. All right. It's at that point on March the 9th, 1865, Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. And many believe that's the end of the war. Actually, it's not. Jefferson Davis avoids capture in April and is running around the deeper parts of the South, trying to recruit and create his own Confederate army to keep this war going. He knows about large groups of Confederates in Texas that are refusing to stop fighting. So he's trying to go west, hook up with them, start reorganizing the Confederacy, and continue the fight on. However, Jefferson Davis is captured on May the 10th, and at that point, the war is over. All right. So we've got the Civil War. All right. A very quick go through. But with that, that's the end of this lecture today. So go over it and think about it. Kind of think, what do you think were some of the major effects? What are some of the importances of the Civil War? How did it reshape America? All right. Everybody have a good day. Stay safe, stay healthy. Bye.